All right, we're going to be in Mark chapter 2 today, starting in verse 23, if you want to turn there. So this is message 2 this year of our annual January series on Sabbath. And so first of all, if you've never heard the word Sabbath before, it's a word that refers to, we celebrate Sabbath on Sunday, which is the first day of the week because that's the day that Jesus was risen from the dead. The Jews celebrated it on Saturday, the last day of the week. It's a tradition that goes all the way back to Genesis, that goes back to God's creation of the world, where he worked for 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested from his work. He looked at what he did. He looked at the beauty and the wonder, and he just enjoyed what he had done. As God began to give laws to the Israelites in the Old Testament, Sabbath was one of the 10 initial commandments of God, saying, look, for 6 days you work, on the seventh day you're going to rest. You're going to take a break. You're not going to do all of those other things, and it has been a pattern throughout all of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament, and it continues today. And so what we're looking at is, well, what does that mean? Excuse me. What does it mean for us to celebrate or to observe Sabbath? Now, last year, if you were with us, we talked a lot about the principles behind it, about the atmosphere and our attitude, how Sabbath was not meant to just be a list of do's and don'ts, because then that ends up looking a lot like a to-do list. It's just a to-don't list, which is almost as bad. It's still putting pressure on us. It's still worrying about what I'm supposed to do and not do and those kind of things. We talked last year about how Sabbath is, at its heart, a time for our relationship with God to be deepened. We talked about how if you have two choices, and if you can choose what you call a Sabbath that's just sitting and watching TV for 12 hours, or doing things that are maybe physically laborious, but doing it in the spirit and presence of God, that this more fully exemplifies the character of Sabbath than the other. That it's not just about doing whatever we want. In fact, it's not about that at all, which we're going to talk about today. It has to do with being in the presence of God and being led by him. It is a time to just rest in his presence. So that was last year. This year we're talking a lot more practically, because the reality is, if you have to choose between being lazy and doing whatever you want and being busy in the presence of God, you should choose this option. But ideally you don't choose either of those. This year we're talking about how really God does in fact encourage and even command us to rest on Sabbath, and that is what we should be striving for. So the first step is changing our mindsets around what the central core aspect of Sabbath is. The second step that we're taking this year, I'm taking this year myself, I'm really trying to commit to it, is actually making that physical space for the spiritual to happen. And that's what we talked about last week. That's what we're going to continue talking about for the next few months. So in Mark chapter 2, we have a story that we see a picture of Jesus on the Sabbath and how he viewed it and what his priorities were. And it's going to help us to understand exactly what it is that God wants from us as we celebrate Sabbath. So here's our story. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as Jesus and his disciples made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So here's what we have going on here. Jesus and his disciples are walking along. It's the seventh day of the week. It's their Sabbath, so they're not walking far, and they're hungry. And so they're walking through these fields, and it could have been wheat or oats or possibly even corn. And they're picking the heads either of corn or of barley or whatever it was. And it describes elsewhere in other Gospels, they're rolling it in their hands. Or if it's corn, they're husking it, and they're eating it, right? And then so the Pharisees see this. Apparently they were just following Jesus around, and they see this and they call Jesus out and they say, hey, why are your disciples doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? Why are your disciples breaking the law? Now, first, a clarification. What they were doing was not wrong in itself. It was only unlawful on the Sabbath. And so we kind of have this idea of, well, we can almost imagine that the Pharisees are upset because they're stealing, because that's kind of what they're doing. They're walking through some random person's garden and just eating food out of it. How many people grow gardens? How many of you, how many people grow or try to grow gardens? There we go. So many more hands went up. I appreciate your honesty. We're all really self-aware gardeners in here, myself included. How many people, if you went out to your garden at the end of the day and just saw random people walking through and eating your food, how many people would enjoy that? Right? Especially all of you who said you attempt to garden, if somebody came through and ate that one ear of corn that you actually got to grow, right? That would be really frustrating, and we would consider that theft. Obviously, if it was someone you'd given permission, but so we have this idea, or you could have this idea that what they're doing is just wrong. But in fact, that was actually perfectly legal in their culture. It was actually, there's a law in the Old Testament that says that you can walk through your neighbor's grain field and pick grain to eat for the day with your hands. You just can't use a sickle. All right, that's what the law says. You can use your hands, you can't use a sickle. If that sounds weird to anybody, let me give you an example. Because we have a very applicable principle here in our current culture. I don't know if this is true in every town, but this is true in Wolcott. If you live in the town of Wolcott, and if you are a resident here, you have the right to go down to the town garage with your pickup truck or with some buckets and a shovel and take sand out of the massive sand pile and put it into your truck or into some buckets to take back to your house and sand your driveway, all right? Legally, you have the right to do that your taxes pay for the sand that they put on the roads, and it also has been made available for residents. So that's legal. They say you can do that. Like, you don't have to go at 2 a.m. with a flashlight and sneak in. It's legal, all right? Now, if you go over there and you've got a 10-yard dump truck and you're backing an excavator off of a trailer and loading up that dump truck, that's probably not okay, because you're probably not just sanding your front walkway, you're probably going out to make some money, right? So you understand the difference there, that it's okay if you go up with a shovel and take a little bit of sand for your driveway, but if you start hauling off truckloads, that kind of crosses the line. Same principle here, okay? You can't go and harvest somebody's field of wheat, but if you're walking through it and you're hungry, legally by Jewish law, you had the right to eat of anybody's food. And that was just the rule, right? Because you couldn't stop at McDonald's if you were hungry back then. So if you were miles from home and you weren't able to get back for a meal and you were hungry, it was a part of the law that you could do this. So this is a very normal practice for them. What was specifically unlawful was the fact that they were doing it on the Sabbath. So just to clarify that they're not doing something illegal, they're not stealing, it was only wrong because it was done on the Sabbath and it was considered work. So then Jesus gives this example, and he gives the story of David, where David eats bread out of the temple that was only supposed to be for the priests. Now, if you know anything about the Jewish religion, there are a number of items that would be used for sacrifices and different rituals that were for the priests to eat. And so, for example, if you brought in a meat sacrifice, we won't go really far into it today, but part of the sacrifice would be burned, but most of the sacrifice would actually go to the priests. We talked about this actually a few months ago, that even in the Old Testament, the sacrifices people made, they weren't just destroyed because God liked destroying things, that they worshiped God by giving meat that then fed the priests that worked in the temple. So the sacrifices actually provided sustenance in some sort of a living for the priests in those days. However, all of that food that had been sacrificed or used in a certain ceremony, it was only lawful for the priests to eat it. First of all, because of the issue of holiness, that the priests were purified before God for these ceremonial practices, and also because that ensured that the priests actually got what they were supposed to get and nobody else could take it from them, and it ensured that God's clergy were well taken care of. And so Jesus reminds them that there is a time that David went in and he ate the bread that he wasn't allowed to eat because he wasn't a priest. Now, what's interesting about it, if you turn to the passage, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 6 specifically. Basically, David is walking along. He comes up to this house of worship. He goes into the priest and he says, "Look, my men and I have traveled a long way. We're hungry. Can we please have some bread?" And if you read through the passage, it's interesting because what happens is the high priest actually suggests to David that he eat the consecrated bread. David, and it's funny, I never caught this until this week. Apparently I had never read the story or not read it well enough. You kind of have this idea that David sneaks into the temple and he sees this bread up here on a table and he looks around and nobody's looking and he goes and he grabs it and he takes it out and he and his men eat it. Especially, given the context. But what actually happens is David goes in and he says, look, can I just have some loaves of bread to take back to my men? The high priest says, well, all we have left is the consecrated bread, but as long as you have kept yourselves pure, you can take it. And so David was given permission by the high priest to break that law. And so this is the story that Jesus brings up to the Pharisees. And so he goes on to say then, this phrase which is so crucial, he says, Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so you've probably heard this verse before, maybe you haven't. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he brings up this really interesting point of the fact that the Sabbath was created for our benefit. The Sabbath was created to be a blessing to us, that God didn't create the world and then have the Sabbath and say, man, I really need to make some people to not do anything on this day because it's not significant enough that I'm not doing anything. We need more people not doing anything. I don't know what that would do, but that's what Jesus is talking about. Because try and picture it the other way around. And if you try and think about it logically, it doesn't make any sense, right? The Sabbath day wouldn't really even exist if there wasn't anyone to celebrate it. And Sabbath is not a tangible thing. It's not a person. It's not an entity. And so there's no reason that we need to serve Sabbath by any means. And so if you try and wrap your head around us serving Sabbath and us being created for Sabbath, it's just a ridiculous concept that doesn't make any sense. And yet, that's often the way we picture it. And this is really speaking to what we talked about last year to a great degree, but this idea that we have to serve the Sabbath, right? This idea that we have to do it well enough, and that we have to produce in order to serve the Sabbath day, which is completely backwards. And so Jesus reminds us the way it's supposed to be, that Sabbath was created for us. And it doesn't really make sense the other way around. You see, Sabbath is a gift from God to us. And Sabbath was one of those gifts that doesn't really come at any specific time and for any specific reason. Here's what I thought about this week as I was thinking about Sabbath. I remember the best thing as a kid, and maybe this is just me or maybe you guys agree, but does anybody remember getting, and this didn't happen often for me, which is maybe why I get excited about it, but does anybody remember ever getting a present between Christmas and your birthday and being really excited about it? Now, my parents were the kind of parents that would be like, well, we're going to buy you this thing, but Christmas is only 14 months away, so we're just going to save it for Christmas, right? Anybody else's parents like that if it was after January 2nd and they wanted to buy you something, they just wait for Christmas? Any parents like that? Oh, you need socks? Well, you can just be barefoot for the next 5 months because Christmas is coming up, right? That's kind of how my family was. And so we would have big Christmases because it was like a year's worth of all the stuff you needed. But for me then, anytime I got a present any other time in the year, it was really cool because you just kind of get used to Christmas and birthdays are when you get presents and everything else I had to save up my allowance for. And so when I got a present another time of the year, it was always really exciting for me. And that's how I feel Sabbath relates to us, right? It's not something that God gave for any specific purpose or at any time, but he just gave it because we needed it, right? And for me, that's how those other presents always came. It was my parents would say, for instance, one of them was a bike. I remember when I was in 6th grade, I got a black Huffy bicycle. We bought it over at Ames. How many people remember Ames over in Morrisville? Good old Ames, right? It wasn't really good, but which is why they went out of business. But I remember we went over there, and I hadn't had a new bike in ages, and my bike was falling apart. And I remember going over there, and I picked it out, and I still remember exactly what it looked like. I remember what the handlebars and the grips looked like. And I was so excited because it wasn't Christmas or my birthday, but my parents just said, you really, really need a bike. And so we're going to go buy it for you. And we're going to spend as much or more on the bike as we would on any of your birthday or your Christmas presents. And it doesn't count as your Christmas or your birthday. It's not one of those like, just so you know, you're not unwrapping anything on your birthday. It wasn't one of those. It was just you really need this and I want to give it to you. And that's what Sabbath is. God looks at us and he says, look, there isn't even a reason for this. This isn't just because I need to find something to give you. You just need this so much that I am going to give it to you. And so when we begin to unpack that idea that Sabbath was created for us and not the other way around, Sabbath stops being, hey, did you take Sabbath this week? No, I'm sorry. Right? That doesn't make sense. Like, did you unwrap your present? No, I'm sorry. I'll get to it in a minute, okay? Right? Like, if you give your kids a present and you want them to open it and they treat it like a chore, that wouldn't make any sense. Right? Because that's how my kids treat chores is, hey, did you clean the litter box yet? No, I'm going to do it, okay? You know, I cleaned it. I know I didn't clean it well, but I'll clean it better tomorrow. Right? These are the kind of things that we hear. That's how that's how we react to chores, right? I've never had a kid in my household. You're getting more today. I've never had a kid in my household go to open a present and then forget that they were opening it and go do something else like they do with chores, right? They don't do that because they're excited about it. It's a gift. But we have that mindset towards Sabbath, that we treat it like a chore when really it is a gift to us. Sabbath was created for you. God looked at you and said, you need a break, you need time to rest, you need time to hear my voice, and you need time to prepare for what's coming in the next week. You need to heal from last week, you need to strengthen for this week, and I'm giving you a gift in order to make that happen. And then Jesus goes on to say this other phrase. He says that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, we first look at that as Jesus being able to say to the Pharisees that he has the authority to permit his disciples to break the Sabbath, right? And so in the same way as in the Old Testament, David broke the law, but it was the high priest that told him he could do it. Jesus was allowing his disciples to break the Sabbath. And so the first thing that we immediately go to when we see verse 28 is, well, Jesus has the authority to contradict the Pharisees because he is not only a priest, he is not only an authority on earth, he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is not just a priest, he is not just someone with earthly power, he is a kingly spiritual Lord, and he has that authority. But I believe it goes farther than that. That not only is this about Jesus being able to speak against the priests, this has to do with how Jesus functions concerning Sabbath in your life. Now, here's what I want you to hear. This is one of your fill-ins on your bulletin if you're taking notes, okay? Actually, I think I wrote it down different. Somebody give me a bulletin so I make sure I say it the way you have it. Do you have one, Rach? Oh, good job. I'll give it back. No, actually, I skipped this one in the bulletin. All right, here we go. That's why. So here's what I want you to think about, all right? Sabbath is for you, right? That's our first point, that Sabbath is a gift for you. Wrap your heads around that, have that in your head, but then also think about this, that Sabbath is for you, but it is ruled by the one who is lovingly living in you. All right? And these two things, when they come together, is what makes Sabbath actually happen. That Sabbath is not a thing that you do. It is an atmosphere that you are brought into. It is a tangible gift that God wants to give you. But the key here, and we often miss this, is that Jesus is the Lord of it. He is not the Lord just of rules about Sabbath, right? Which is where we go in this passage. Jesus is not just Lord in that he hands out rules about what you're allowed to do and not do on the Sabbath. That Sabbath is meant to be a living, tangible presence in your life. It's not meant to just be this descriptive idea. It's meant to be something that shows up in your life. And as it shows up in your life, Jesus is Lord, not just of the rules about it, but the Sabbath that you are hopefully experiencing right now. So hopefully you came here today with nothing on your plate. Hopefully you came here today saying, this is my day of Sabbath. This is my day of rest. This is my day to just sit and allow God to do whatever it is that I am supposed to do. And when you actually engage in Sabbath, you're giving him the authority to say, Jesus, this day is yours. You're the Lord of it. You are in charge of it. You're not just about giving me rules. You are literally overseeing everything that happens in this day. Because here's what typically happens with Sabbath. Here's our typical mindset. Our typical mindset is, I must create this Sabbath for God. I must create this Sabbath for God. I must make sure I don't do too many things today to make him happy. I must make sure that I stay home enough. Right? The Pharisees had rules, and I won't go more than this many paces away from my house, which if you're OCD like me would have been amazing, but for you normal people would have driven you nuts, right? I'm always counting my steps. I'm always counting everything, so that would have worked fine for me. But they were making up these rules, and you can go to your neighbor's house if there isn't a fence, and you can lift this much weight, and you can open the oven as long as the light doesn't come on. If the light's on already, then it's fine. They just made all of these rules, and it's this idea of creating a Sabbath so that we can get to the end of our Sunday, wrap it up, put a bow on it, and say, here, God, is it good enough for you? But that's not what Sabbath is, because first of all, it's a gift for us, and second of all, he is the Lord of it, you're not. And so it's not about us creating the Sabbath for God. It's about you and I realizing that God created Sabbath for us. That it's not about taking it to him and saying, God, what do you think of this Sabbath I created? It's about God giving it to you, and he's kind of like twitchy like parents get when they really want their kids to open their presents faster because they're so excited. He says, I gave this to you. I made this for you. I created this. I'm ruling over it. I'm the Lord of it. This is for you. Open it. And that's where we get hung up, because we don't want to open it. We want to structure it ourselves. Because here's the problem. If I asked every single one of you right now, well, I'm going to ask you, I'm asking every single one of you, what is it that you need most today? Love. And food. All right? So everybody think about, what is it that you need most today? There's probably, 30, 40 of us here today. My guess is one or two of you are probably right. Faith's one of them. I think Faith's right about what she needs. The rest of you are probably wrong. I'm probably wrong. Because what I need to do today is do lots of work. That's what I need to do every day. If you ask me, what do I need to do every day? There is a wood project or something that needs to be welded or fixed, or that's what I need to do because I've got to get it done. What?
You need to love me.
I also need to love Faith. I'm aware of that. But that one's legitimate. But that's what because I just see the to-do list. Every single one of you has an idea of what you need to do today or what you need today, and most of you are wrong. And here's why. How many of you know what's going to happen tomorrow?
Not me.
How many of you know what's going to happen Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday? None of you do, but he does. And so what happens is we decide what we need. And we say, well, today I really just need a day off from everything. I'm going to lock myself in my room, right? Because that's what we think we need. But we don't know what's coming tomorrow. We don't know what's coming the day after that. God sees that, and the purpose of him being the Lord of our Sabbath is that he can give us the present that we need. How many people ever opened a present, or parents have given your kid a present that was for an upcoming trip or event that the kid didn't know about? Right? How many people have gotten a bathing suit for Christmas and been like, great, can't wait to play with this afternoon, right? And you don't know that your parents are taking you to Florida 2 weeks later, but you open the present up and you're like, if there's one thing I would have said I needed this Christmas, there's 3 feet of powder outside. I have a snowmobile. I don't have a snowmobile jacket. You gave me a bathing suit, right? We would say, I need a snowmobile jacket. And your parents say, actually, tomorrow you're going to Florida. You're not going to be snowmobiling. You are actually going to be swimming, because they know. And Sabbath functions the same way. That I might say, you know, I've got all of these other things that I need to do this week, and I need to stay at home. I've just got a bunch of reading to get done, and I've got this reading, and I've got to finish reading this book. I said I was going to read this book, and I've got to read it, and I'm going to read it on my Sabbath. And God says, you know, actually, you're going to break your leg on Tuesday, so you probably don't want to do any reading on Sunday. I'm going to have you go for a run instead. Now, I might say that's the last thing I need to do, but God knows, right? Just an example. Hopefully nobody breaks a leg this week. But this is the problem, that the whole idea of Sabbath is that it is God healing us from the past week and preparing us for the week to come. Now, you may know what's happened this week, but you don't know what's coming. He does. And so often what we do is we keep going back to this idea of us creating our Sabbath, even though we don't know what it is. And we always go back to it. Even if we start to change our mindset, even if we start to say, you know what, God, all right, I'm going to do what you want me to do. We start chipping things in, right? We start adding things. Say, God, I'm going to do whatever you want today once I finish this. So I'm just going to finish this and then whatever you want me to do after this one thing. And then we add a couple more onto it, right? It's almost like when you ever help your kid clean, or watch your kid clean and try not to help them, and you keep jumping in and reminding them what to do and what they forgot, and you say, hey, you forgot this part of it, you forgot this piece, you need to go back and do this. You see, we kind of approach God that way with our Sabbath, where we say, God, I'm going to take a day of rest, whatever you want me to do. And then he tells us what he wants us to do, and we say, well, that's great, but you forgot something. There's something else we need to add in here, and we micromanage it. And we keep getting back to this idea of us creating the Sabbath instead of allowing God to give it to us. So here's what it comes down to. All right, here is just the baseline principle here. It isn't Sabbath. It is not Sabbath if Jesus is not Lord of it. If he's not Lord of it, it's not a Sabbath. It's just a day off. God doesn't call us to a day off. God doesn't say, I just want you to sit for a day. He doesn't say, I don't want you to go to work. He doesn't say, I don't want you to clean. He calls us to Sabbath. And there's a reason why this term doesn't get used for anything else. Right? This is why we've kept the word Sabbath. We could just use English words that actually made sense to us. We keep Sabbath because it's different. Because it's not a day to rest exclusively. It's not a day to relax. It's not a day to kick back. It's not, oh man, can't wait for Sunday. It's my kickback day. It's not your football watching day. It's not your basketball watching day. It's not your video game or your movie or your Netflix binge. It's not any of those things. It's Sabbath. It's entirely different from every other concept that we have to describe in our language. It is a day that we should be resting because we shouldn't be bringing in our own to-do list, but he is the Lord of it, which means he knows what we need, he's going to bring us to what we need, and we have to allow him to do that. That Sabbath is you wake up and say, God, I've got nothing on my plate today. Whatever you want me to do, wherever you want me to go, I've got no commitments. And then you give him the freedom to do whatever it is in you that you need to do that day. That the most important principle, if you want to experience Sabbath, if you want to experience a healthy rhythm, if you want to get out of the go, 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 stress, 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 collapse on vacation for a week, and then go right back to it, if you want to get out of that unhealthy cycle that God never called you to, this is the key, is having a Sabbath that he is truly Lord of. And if you go into Sunday with a to-do list, then you can't do that. If you go into Sunday with, these are the things that I've got to do today, that cannot happen to the extent that it wants it to happen. Now, do things come up? Sure. We're not saying that things don't come up. We're not saying that emergencies don't happen. And in fact, the emergency part is exactly why we need to do this, because we need a day where an emergency can't happen and it doesn't knock things off of our to-do list. And so this is both practical and spiritual. Spiritually, you need to have the mindset of saying, God, I want you to be Lord of this day. I want you to guide me. I want you to lead me. You need to open your Sabbath in prayer. You need to close Saturday in prayer, preparing for Sunday, because Sabbath preparation starts Saturday, Friday, maybe even Thursday, that the entire back half of your week, really, eventually, my hope for you is the end for Sabbath. How many days do we wake up and say, oh, it's Sunday, right? That we prepare days in advance for Sunday. And so part of it is spiritual, it's mindset, it's saying, God, I want you to lead me, being open to his leading. And some of this is that spiritual needs to come out into the practical, because it doesn't matter where your mind is, if your body is occupied, so is your heart and so is your brain. And so a lot of this is practical, right? In the Old Testament, Friday was the day of preparation. So Saturday was the Sabbath, Friday was the day you got ready for Sabbath. And the focus of Friday was getting ready for Saturday. It wasn't that Friday was the last day to finish up from the other days. It was a day to get ahead, not a day to catch up, right? And so that's what your Saturday should be. Now, ideally, obviously, you have a job that allows you to get Saturday and Sunday off. That doesn't always happen. And hey, if you have to work on Sunday, we're not saying that this isn't going to work for you. We're not going to say it's not going to happen. I made the commitment to make Sunday my Sabbath so that we could Sabbath together, and we want to do that to the greatest extent possible. But I'm not saying that you're bad if you have to work on Sundays, all right? So don't hear that. But we have to prepare physically for Sabbath, which means that Saturday is not cram as much as I can into it, and whatever spills over into Sunday, I'll finish on Sunday. Right? Sunday is not your bumper day to finish anything that doesn't get done on Saturday. Saturday is your day to get done whatever needs to be done on Sunday, and even I would encourage you to prepare for Monday. And so this is what I was doing yesterday, all right? This was my step one, and I wasn't perfect, all right? But it was a step. Yesterday, I got ready for today. I finished preparing my sermon in the afternoon. I got all my notes written out. And then on Monday, I know that I'm going to do a side job. And so I need to have all my tools in my trailer. I have it all ready to go. They've got to be all loaded up so I can hook up and leave at probably 6 o'clock in the morning to get out and build a porch, all right? So I knew that all needed to be done. And so I didn't wait until today to do it. Not only did on my preparation day yesterday, not only did I get ready for church so that I could wake up this morning, I did not print bulletins this morning. I usually do. Bulletins were printed last night. They were in my computer bag along with my Bible, along with my notes. It was sitting by the front door so that I could wake up this morning, eat breakfast with my kids, get dressed, and grab my bag on the way out to the door and go to church the same way everybody else in this building does. I got here early, had worship practice, did some shoveling out front, and I'm here for church. All of that was done yesterday. In addition to be ready for this morning, I got ready for tomorrow. Because all I have to do tomorrow morning is hitch my trailer onto my truck, get dressed, and go. I even got ready for Monday on Saturday so that I don't have to end my Sabbath early to prepare for tomorrow. That I don't have to be thinking this afternoon about what am I doing tomorrow, what do I have to get ready for tomorrow, that I've got everything ready for Monday, and Monday night I'll figure out the rest of my week. Now, I will say this, I went to bed at 2 in the morning. So I'm not perfect yet, all right? I've still got some work to do. And so technically, if we're going by the hours, I sort of finished on Sunday, but we're going to count it as Saturday, all right? Because I was still awake. So that was my step one. Hopefully next week will be 11 at the latest, and ideally it would be dinner time. But one thing at a time. But that's my step one. So that today, there's nothing on my to-do list for today, and there's nothing on my to-do list for tomorrow. So I am open and free for God to work in my life. So there's the spiritual side, and there's the physical side. There's our attitude, and there's our atmosphere, all right? Attitude is where our head is at, where our mindset at. Atmosphere is what is my surrounding looking like? Do I have all of these things crowding me on Sunday, or am I open for God to work? Because if he's not Lord of it, it's not a Sabbath. It's just a day off. And we don't need a day off. I mean, you might need a day off, but we really don't need a day off. Because I know what we've got coming up this week. I know a lot of people that have hard stuff coming up this week. Things that we're nervous about, things that we're scared about, things that are uncertain, decisions that we have to make. You don't need a day off to prepare for those. You need his presence and his power and his wisdom in your life. You need a Sabbath. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for the gifts that you give us. And Lord, I pray that we accept them rather than trying to bundle up and give back to you what you're trying to give to us. And so, Lord, let us open ourselves to what you would do in our lives. Let us not be so tied to what it is we think that we need, that we miss what you have, but let us go into our Sabbath saying, Lord, I don't know what you need to do in me. I don't know what you need to prepare in me for the week ahead, but whatever it is, make it abundantly clear what I am to do today so that I can be prepared for whatever it is that you're calling me to do in this week, for whatever storms are coming in my way, or for whatever person I have to pull out of the waves. But work in me today. Be Lord of my Sabbath. Be Lord of my life.